नाम संकीर्तन की जय, श्री प्रभुपाद की जय.
Thank you, Prabhu. Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome all of you. We have Sundar Rupa Shyama. He is very, very busy in celebrating Janmashtami, organizing it, but still is kindly allowed us to come here. I'm really happy to welcome you, Sundar Rupa Shyama Prabhu. Thank you so much for first of all accepting.
Thanks for giving this opportunity.
And we have already shared due to already time, and I will quickly, you can over to you, Prabhu. And Prabhu is very systematic in presenting the Shastras. We are very, very fortunate to hear, and we have posted his profile to all of you in the WhatsApp. So I think without due, I think we can start, Prabhu. Over to you. We'll go up to 9:30, Prabhu. If after that some people want to hang around, ask questions, that's okay. But we 9:30 we complete the session.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Prabhuji. So welcome all. We'll just offer our prayers. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadadi Swapadandikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurum Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sakagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padam Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpade Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Rishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namavom Vishnupadaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschata Desatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Srivasadi Gaurabhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare Srinvatam Swakata Krishna Punyashravana Kirtanaha Hridayantastohi Abhadrani Vidunoti Sugaratsatam Ite Cham Sakala Pumsa Krishnastu Bhagavan Swayam Indriyari Vyakulam Lokam Hridayante Yuge Yuge. Hare Krishna. So our Gopi Prabhu always gives very high challenges. I was just wondering, we generally speak for about a couple of hours, taking one sloka of Srimad Bhagavatam. So now Prabhu is asking to speak the entire canto in 1 hour's time. So I was wondering, how is it possible to even achieve this? Okay. So what we will do is, I thought through many methods. So maybe what we'll do is we'll just do a summary, like a story format, the entire canto. And then wherever details are required, we'll spend some time on the detailing. So that way we can cover most of the slokas or most of the chapters in third canto. The third canto is called the status quo. So third canto, has thematically about 33 chapters. And if you look at the division of these chapters, is all about how Vidura begins his journey by asking questions. And then, the starting of the chapter describes about the Lord's pastimes, both in Vrindavan and pastimes of activities of the Lord. Then it is mostly spent about Vidura's conversation with Maitreya Rishi. Initially, the conversation begins with Vidura and Uddhava, and later on, Uddhava is not able to answer, or not able to give because of the age difference. So he is requesting him to go to Maitreya, and then the conversation between Maitreya and Vidura begins. So the first section of the Canto 3 is more about the creation of the universal form, and then describes about the activities of Brahmaji in manifesting, how he got manifested from Garbhodaksha Vishnu. Then after his manifestation, how is he offering prayers to Lord? So Brahmaji's prayers, which comes in third canto. Then the various divisions of creation of Brahmaji. So then there's a lot of explanation about the calculation of how do you understand Kala, time, and then how the material, the atomic size, and all these things, all descriptions are all given here. Then the actual activities of creation, because Brahma just creates bodies, and then the life and the activities are done by the Lord. So then the creation of the Kumaras, then the curse of Jai and Vijay, and then it starts with the appearance of Varahadev, right? So then the other part of it is about the appearance of Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha. So that's the kind of conversation that Vidura switches to understand how this happens, right? Then the story, the canto goes further down detail. It talks about details of Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha. Then there is conversation between Maitreya and Vidura, which clearly talks about Swayambhu Manu and his activities, supporting progeny of Brahmaji, where Swayambhu Manu is in charge of increasing the population, right? Swayambhu Manu. So then it continues. It continues where the pastimes and descriptions about Kardama Muni and Devahuti, who's the first daughter of Swayambhu Manu. Then it talks about details of Swayambhu Manu's interaction with Devahuti and Kardama Muni leaving Devahuti in search of his completion of his goals of life. Then the appearance of Kapila Dev. Then in that Kapila Dev, there are many, many chapters about his Sankhya philosophy. And so what we will do is we'll probably break the instructions of Kapila Dev Muni into simple questions. So that we'll try to say what's the message he's trying to give. And, we'll summarize with the activities of Kapila Muni, right? So this is pretty much the third canto in a gist. So we'll see whether we can cover as much as possible in our discussion today. Any questions we will try to handle at the end so that I can have a particular flow in what I'm speaking to here. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now in Canto 3, if you look at the description, it starts with explanation about how Vidura comes into the picture, right? So we all know Vidura was in Hastinapur serving the kingdom under the instructions and the direction of Dhritarashtra. But however, he saw that Dhritarashtra was getting deviated under the influence of his son, who was demonic in nature. When Vidura tried to instruct Dhritarashtra that his son is adharmic in nature and he needs to take a different stance. But even though he advised Dhritarashtra a lot, Dhritarashtra had the affection for his son. So because of that, he could not hear any of his instruction. So the eventuality was Duryodhan had to misbehave with Vidura, which leads Vidura leave the palace, the palace of the kingdom of Hastinapur. So now Vidura goes in search of Prayashchita. I mean, more you would call it as cleansing, right? So he goes to various places of importance, pilgrimage, and then tries to cleanse himself. So in the process of his journey, he meets Uddhava. So Uddhava, a cousin to Krishna, the greatest devotee of Krishna. After hearing the Uddhava Gita from Krishna, Krishna completes his pastimes on this earthly planet, right? And at the end, when the Yadu's time frame was completed, Krishna went to the banks of Saraswati, river Saraswati, and he sat under a tree there. Now, Uddhava, though he heard the entire instructions of Gita, he wanted to, hear more from Lord Krishna, because his separation from Krishna was something unbearable for him. So he also already has an instruction that Uddhava needs to go to Badrikashrama and then recite the Srimad Bhagavatam, give the knowledge of Srimad Bhagavatam to all the sages there, right? So even though he had that instruction, but his mode of separation was intolerable from Krishna. So he goes to Krishna. And this is when, Uddhava gets the opportunity to hear the entire Srimad Bhagavatam, right? So when Krishna narrated the Srimad Bhagavatam Uddhava, Maitreya Rishi was passing by, and then he also, sat there to hear that Srimad Bhagavatam. So that is how you can see Maitreya Rishi once again getting the nourishment of hearing Srimad Bhagavatam from that Supreme Lord, right? So this is how the initial journey of Uddhava, Vidura, and Maitreya coming to this conversation, right? Now Vidura hears all the pastimes of Krishna from Uddhava in the 5th chapter, right? So then what happens? We are again trying to reconnect here to understand how this conversation began, right? When Vidura asked Uddhava, that you heard all the pastimes of Krishna, you are aware of everything, so why did you explain me? Uddhava explains in a very minuscule of those details. He doesn't go into those details. But when he asks more and more questions to Uddhava is recommending him to go to hear Maitreya, because just the age factor, right? Maitreya was more senior, and Vidura is like in a fatherly position to Uddhava. So he does not want to instruct someone who's elderly in nature. Now, we must have heard in Bhagavad Gita that Krishna says, Shishyasteham sadimam tvam prapanna. So generally an instruction, when someone is giving, it is more in terms of guru, shishya, disciple, because that's how the flow of knowledge can happen. So considering that, in that mood, he recommends Vidura to go to Maitreya Rishi, who's also in the nearby place, near Haridwar, I suppose, to hear this entire pastime. Okay. Now, once Vidura approached Maitreya, he actually glorified the process of hearing Krishna Katha. Now, how did he do that? He asked many, many questions to Maitreya. And the first set of questions he's asking Maitreya is about, understanding about the pastimes of Krishna and things like that. Then he's asking for descriptions about Purushavatars and Leela avatars, right? So in the Purushavatars and Leela avatars, the first part of the description is about the formation of this universe, right? How this universe is formed. And he's asking to what extent the energies of the Lord, they manifest in creation of this universal form. So these are all the kind of questions that he's asking. And when Maitreya Rishi is trying to talk about it, he says, even though I've heard and I have done, I've understood this subject, but I don't understand the subject fully to a large extent, but I still speak about it just for my purification, right? So that's the kind of mood Maitreyi has in his conversation with Vidura. Okay. So in his first conversation under the universal creation, he's talking about what is Ishvara Tattva. Then the second question he's talking about is what is Jiva Tattva, right? So in the first question about Ishvara Tattva, he's asking about the process of creation, how the origin of the Supreme Lord, Mahavishnu, how the quadruple expansion, all those questions connected to the material modes of nature. So all those things are what Vidura is asking. Now, Maitreyi starts to explain him about the Pradhana and then the Mahatattva, right? Now, when he starts to explain, the biggest question that Vidura has is that they're all coming and there are material modes and then giving rise to material universe. Okay. Now, Vidura's doubt was, okay, now these are all manifesting from that Lord, Supreme Lord. So that means the material universal creation must have a direct link between Lord's material creation, the three modes of nature, and the Supreme Lord. So his basic question is, the Lord is Aptakama, right? He's self-satisfied. So now if he's self-satisfied, generally he need not do any activity. Either you can call it as serious or playing a lot. He does not need to do any activity. Now, generally what happens, why do a living entity performs an activity? There is a need for doing an activity. And best example, say I want to eat a specific food. So I go and cook. Now, if there is no desire to have the specific food, then I will not cook. So similarly, Vidura's question is, why is there a need for such an activity of creation? And what is the need for the Lord to perform it, right? Now, if Lord is already self-satisfied, and why he does this? So that's the kind of conversation questions that he's asking. So Maitreyi Rishi, when he hears this question, he says that if anyone thinks the Lord is overwhelmed with material modes, just like an ordinary soul, he says this breaks all logic. There's no logic that you can apply to this rule, right? Now, what Maitreyi Rishi is trying to tell us, the Lord may be connected to these trigunas, three modes of material nature, the universal forms, but he says that they are not, the Lord is not influenced by those three modes of material nature, right? He makes very, very clear statements. The first thing that he says is, the material nature is also part of Lord's energy. It may be inferior energy of the Lord, but it is also part of Lord's energy. And the material nature manifests from the Lord, and from this material nature, the three modes of nature also manifest. Right? So that's the first description that Maitreyi Rishi is giving to Vidura. While he's giving this description, he is making it very clear that even though Lord is connected to this material nature, it does not mean that the material nature can control the Lord. The material nature is subordinate to the Lord. That means what? It works under the instructions of the Lord. It does not influence the Lord. So what does that mean? Whether the Lord is in the spiritual world or in the material world, he is uninfluenced by any of his energies. He can only control and influence those energies. Right? So that's the details that he is giving. So for example, in the 7th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, we understood these two slokas, right? Bhumirapo nalavayu kammano buddhirevacha. Then apareyamitastvanyam prakritim viddhimepa. So here you can see the description about how these material natures are being created, the 5 gross elements and the 3 subtle elements, right? So he's giving those explanations about the details of this material nature and how the Lord is beyond these 3 modes of material nature. Okay, so now it raises to a curious question for Vidura. So Vidura is asking, then what is the position of Jiva Shakti? So Maitreyi is telling that this Jiva Shakti is actually part of the superior energy of the Lord, right? Now, generally, you can see that, even now it is true that this Jiva Shakti tries to manipulate or exploit another energy of the Lord. That is the material energy, the Mahamaya of the Lord. We always exploit the material energy of the Lord. And sometimes you can see that the material energy influences the Jiva Shakti. So that means you can see the interaction and one energy of the Lord trying to interact with the energy of the Lord in different manner, right? So that's the kind of control that Maitreyi is trying to explain with Rahya, right? So sometimes this can control first and sometimes that controls first, right? So there is a clear interaction. Okay. Second is, he is saying that even though these energies are multifaceted, Parashya Shakti, that means the Lord's energy is unlimited in nature, even though they manifest from the Lord, it does not entangle the Lord at any point in time, right? So these energies, they act in separation of the Lord, right? Okay. Now, what does this mean? This means that when Lord descends to perform his pastimes or his activities, the Mahamaya, the Shakti or the Gunas, cannot influence the Lord just like how it can influence the Jivas. So that's the first explanation he is giving. Now, Vidra is more confused now. So what is he asking? Okay, if the Lord cannot be influenced by the material nature, and you're saying the Jiva Shakti, who is also part of the spiritual nature of the Lord, and he is superior in nature of the Lord, how he can get entangled, right? So technically it's not possible, right? So then how is it possible? And why is that even though the Jivas cannot be entangled, how is that they're suffering in this material world, right? They suffer out of many miseries, the Adhyatmika, Adidevika, Adibhautika, and all kinds of difficulties. Then he's also asking that it is clear that the Paramatma is also accompanying the living entities. If the Paramatma is accompanying the living entity, then how come there is suffering in presence of the Lord? See how, for example, I'm in a kingdom, and if the king is a very able king, and able king means an able administrator and a protector. So I'm always under the protection of the king. Now, if I am guaranteed under the protection of the king, then how is that I am suffering? Right? So like that, he's asking these questions to get clarification. So now you see these questions are asked for our benefit, right? Otherwise, we will never understand how the spirit soul, which is superior in nature, and still getting entangled in the Mahamaya energy, which is inferior in nature, right? So for which Maitreyi is answering, right? He's giving a very brilliant answer. So what he says, there's no suffering for the soul. There is no suffering for the soul. And in fact, he says the spirit soul can never suffer material miseries. And that's the answer he gives to that question. Now, if you say that, then what's the meaning of this Adhyatmika, Adidevika, Adibhautika? Who is that? Those influences, and then the living entities are suffering. So Maitreyi is clarifying that a spirit soul is identifying himself with a material body, which is an output or a combination of the material energy. So, for example, they are looking at the relationship with this material world. And all these relationships, identification, is like a dreamy situation for it. That's why it's called illusion in nature, right? The more the living entity identifies it with the material nature, it increases the miseries of the living entity. So the misidentification is the cause of the problem. If the misidentification does not exist, then there is no suffering. So that's the answer Maitreyi is giving. So how is it? So misidentification is like technically the false ego, right? It's a cause of ahankara. Okay. Now what we've understood, the subtle body contains of three elements, right? Mind, intelligence, false ego, right? So the Shastra Bhagavatam says that mind is finer than the gross elements, but intelligence is finer than the mind. And the false ego is finer than the intelligence. So what is the meaning of finer than another? That means, even though we may possess intelligence, right? We may want to act in this way or that way because we want to use our intelligence. The ahankar, the false ego, because it's finer than intelligence and it's subtle in nature, without our knowledge, we can misuse our intelligence in a wrong manner and become identified under this Mahamaya Shakti. So that is how we get illusioned, right? So this is why there is suffering in this world, and there is no other reason. The moment the Jivatma identifies himself with Krishna, which is part of the spiritual energy, then his suffering stops. And he concludes his answer. So he gives lots of examples. The examples are given are like the example of the moon and the moon's image on the water, right? How it is illusionistic, right? If you create a ripple, then the image of the moon on the water goes away, right? So he gives that as an example. Another example you can think of is a ship on an anchor, right? So a ship is like huge. It's really big, it tons and tons of weight. But the anchor is so small, right? Even though anchor is so small and the ship is so huge and powerful, but that anchor can control the ship, right? So these are analogies that will make us understand how an inferior energy can control a superior energy, right? Another example you can think of is an elephant which can carry several tons of weight on with its trunk is bound to a small chain, thinking that, like a state of conditioning, right? So that's how you see we get conditioned into this material world. Maitreya Rishi also here in this context, the author writes the example of the coconut, right? So the coconut pulp within it, if it thinks it is part of the coconut, in the initial stages, it gets attached to the shell so hard. But if you see, a dry coconut, even though it's existing within the same shell, but it is no more, attached to the shell of the coconut, you see, it's easy to remove them. So the point to conclude is that the more we are attached to the activities and the attributes of the elements of this material nature, you will see that causes miseries, right? So that's the kind of conclusion that Maitreya Rishi is giving here. So now it raises to a question. So Prabhuji, this body is awarded to us, and you're saying that we need to be detached from this body. So the point to such an understanding is a spirit soul in a ghostly body cannot connect to the Supreme Lord. Now, if you tell a ghostly body, you have to offer your prayers, do this service and things, it cannot do. It needs a material element in order to perform its devotion service. So this means you need this body, right? So the first understanding is you need this body, you need to maintain it in order to perform the activities of devotion service to please the Supreme Lord. But we should not become attached to this body like Trishanku, right? He was so attached to his beauty of the body that he wanted to go to higher planetary system just with that same body, right? Now, if you look at the way the material world is evolving, the thought process of people is a small deformation in the body they cannot tolerate. They need to go through surgeries, treatments, spend money, and all those things. You see, ignorance of this knowledge is making people to become more and more bodily oriented thoughts and activities. And while realized devotee, he would not worry so much about body, but he will just engage his body in service of the Lord. Right? So you can see how a realized soul and a non-realized soul can act. So now, coming to the conclusion of this conversation, this very, very important conversation between Vidura and Maitreya, you can see that Maitreya is telling that the only solution that you can come to conclusion out of bodily identification is practice of bhakti yoga. Right? So he refers to this sloka from the third canto, chapter 7, text 14. Asesha Shanklesha Shamam Vidate. Right? Gunanavada Shravanam Murare. So what it says, simply by chanting and hearing the transcendental name form of the Lord, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, one can achieve, one can avoid all miserable conditions of this life. Right? You see, Shravanam takes the topmost position. So just by hearing, we get our hearts cleansed. So, he gets attracted for the flavor of the dust of the Lord's lotus feet, right? And that is important. How does he get? Because of Shravanam. Just by hearing, a living entity can go into ecstasy, and going into ecstasy, he can relieve himself from all miseries. Maitreya doesn't stop here. He says that greater than Shravanam is to do service. He says, serving the Lord with that ecstatic love, with that caring attitude, is one step ahead of Shravanam also. Right? So she says that serving Lord and Lord's paraphernalia and Lord's devotees are the topmost. By doing that, one will get the mercy to hear about Lord's and Lord's activities with more detail. Right? So we'll talk about that in more details now. So now he is concluding about how attachment causes misery, and the only solution for attachment, to get rid of attachment, is to practice of bhakti yoga. Now, after hearing all this knowledge, right? So Vidura is talking about, okay, now the clarity on Jiva Tattva and how bhakti yoga will help one come out of the miseries is very, very clear. Now, Vidura is asking a question that, okay, this knowledge of service, this knowledge of Shravan is more theoretical in nature. But how do I realize that in my heart? How do I able to realize in my heart that it transforms my consciousness to put into practice? And how do I do that? Right? So Maitreya is concluding that rendering service to the lotus feet of great Vaishnavas is the solution. Right? We may hear knowledge from a bona fide spiritual master, but the knowledge need to be converted into realization. And when will that realization happen? When we render selfless service to that Guru. Right? So when there's a pure Vaishnava, when we do selfless service to that pure Vaishnava, then what happens? This knowledge, which is theoretical in nature, becomes practical in our heart. And that practical, in our heart will lead us to perform services, avoid offenses to others, and develop submissive attitude. Bhagavad Gita, Tadvidi Pranipatena Pariprashnena Sevi. The submissiveness and service attitude are the key for someone to develop bhakti towards that Lord. Right? So that's the conclusion that Maitreya Rishi gives to Vidura. Okay? So now the conversation continues. Right? Vidura is asking so many questions. And, what our Parikshit Maharaj asked in the 7th chapter of, the second canto, you see Vidura is asking many, many questions, right, in the third canto. You can see in the 7th chapter also, these questions are being asked, right? Now, while these questions are to be answered, Maitreya Rishi is talking about the appearance of Bhagavatam, right? How Bhagavatam was heard, was delivered by the Lord. It came through many paramparas, right? One parampara we know, Lord to Shankarshana, then Parashara Muni, then Brahaspati, then Maitreya and Vidura. So the other is Lord talking to Brahmaji, Narada Muni, Vyasa, Sukadev, Sutta Goswami, and the sages of Naimisharanya Rishis. So you see, in many, many scenarios of how we got Bhagavatam, It is the source is the Lord. So from the Lord, we get this knowledge. That means this knowledge is not influenced by any modes of nature. It is completely uncontaminated and it is in the purest of the form. So it is important to take the details of this knowledge and then practice in our life, right? So then he begins explaining about the creation, the universal form. He starts by talking about the beauty of the Lord, how the Lord's nose, the facial features, his eyebrows. He's describing about the Lord's smile and all these things, right? He says, what is the greatness of a devotee? So greatness of a devotee is when he renders service. He renders service in a very, very selfless manner. And he knows that there's nothing that he's going to take a profit and go home out of that profit. But what does he expect? He doesn't expect anything. And that's the mode of a devotee. Now, when that service is done very nicely, the Lord will give him a smile in his life. That smile is the one that completely satisfies the heart of the Lord, right? So, that's how the Lord reciprocates. You see, one is very contented and very happy. If Krishna is pleased, everything is pleased in this entire creation, right? So that's the motive of a devotee. So when we do our service, right, the return gift that we get from the Lord is a beautiful smile. Okay, so now let's go further in terms of this universal form creation, right? The universal form creation is detailed about how Brahmaji is created from the navel. From the navel of Mahavishnu sprouts a beautiful lotus, and from this lotus manifests Brahmaji, right? Now, once Brahmaji manifests out of this lotus, many, many brilliant things happens. First, initially, when he turns in all directions and then he sees, he doesn't, he's not able to understand who he is, what he is, and then how did he manifest into this position. So all the details are not visible to him. So he tries to, go deeper into the lotus feet, the lotus stem, and then see where it ends. And then he walks and walks and walks, and then finally finds that there's no end. Then again, he comes back and sits and meditates. And he meditates because of the sound vibration of Gayatri, right? So then when all the realization for Brahmaji is got, then Brahmaji knows what his duties and responsibilities are. So at that time is when Brahmaji offers his prayers, right? So in the third canto, you will see, I think the 9th chapter, 1st sloka to the 25th sloka. You will see all Brahmaji's prayers, right? It's a very, very beautiful set of prayers, very profound philosophy, is spoken with a heartfelt realization, right? And, the process of Bhakti Yoga really beautifully glorified in these prayers. So all of us should actually, take this 9th chapter and then spend time how Brahmaji is talking about, the glorification. How is he demonstrating the love of Godhead in his heart, right? See, sometimes we see, but, we are actually hearing through our ears and not through our eyes, right? So now, when we hear Srimad Bhagavatam, the descriptions of various aspects of Srimad Bhagavatam are heard in our ears, but we actually picturize the whole description in front of us. So that means, even though we have eyes, but we are actually seeing through the ears, right? So this is how the sense perceptions, of us starts to manifest into deeper and deeper aspects. Okay. Now, let's talk about sense perception from from oral reception point of view, right? So, for example, when we talk about sense perception, I'm talking about the gist of some of the Brahmaji's prayers, right? So when you talk about sense perception, we see with our senses. So, for example, with our eyes, we see beautiful form of Krishna Balaram, right? Radha Radhika Raman, Jagannath Baladev Subhadra. So like that we see, right? So with our senses, even though we see, we perceive the beautiful form, right? But when we do hearing, Shravanam, right, the oral reception, when we hear that sound vibration, you see the nourishment that you get through your oral reception will have a different realm of realization compared to the sense perception that of others, right? So both have their own way of nourishment for the living entities, right? So, but non-realized devotees who just see the forms of the Lord, right? They may say, okay, Gauranitai, Krishna Balaram, they may say this is a black deity, this is a white deity, this is female, this is male, versus, they may appreciate the external appearances. But when you blend the oral reception with the, with the visual, forms that you see, you can understand the attributes and characters of God, and that's what a devotee appreciates, right? So you see these prayers, they describe so vividly such beautiful, aspects of Jiva's bhakti towards Lord. It really nourishes our heart. So we should all read these prayers, mug up on these slokas, and then practice them heartfully. Okay, so these are the prayers that we should meditate upon now. Now, in this, after this, then Vidura is asking many other questions. So he's asking about what is eternal time? And he's asking about what are the symptoms of eternal time in this conversation with Maitreya, right? So the answers that he gets are eternal time is how these three modes of material nature actually interact, right? So when there's no eternal time, the modes of material nature, they go into a standstill form. So due to time, that is change of time, these three modes of material nature, they interact, right? Excuse me. So Krishna is Kala. So time is looked at like an instrument in the hands of the Lord, right? So when Krishna performs his pastime and when he performs a lot of this material creation, so time is a very important aspect. And by the movement of time, we see activities, right? Time is actually one of the potency of the Lord. Through time, he's able to physically move things, in the material world. So for example, we say every day that the sun, rises in the east and sets in the west. So, it is the time that makes us to understand that, okay, we are moving forward, right? So this is the one biggest dimension that Krishna creates. But time does not exist in the spiritual world. It exists as in, for example, you may have a sunrise and sunset in the spiritual world, but, you see the Krishna is always eternal in his age. He doesn't grow old or something like that. So you see time is also used, in sort of an illusionary aspect of the material world, right? So like that, he's explaining how, the Kala aspect of this creation. Okay. So then as we go into the next subsequent chapters, Brahmaji is now thinking of creation, right? Because once the creation has happened, that means the creation of the 14 planetary systems, then the sun, the moon planets, and all other planets. So now he needs to create these bodies, but the soul enters through this body along with the Paramatma, and that is what causes the activities in the material plane. Now, this is called Sarga and Visarga, right? So Brahmaji is now contemplating, and he is, through his desire to create more and more progeny, he creates this 4 Kumaras. Now, these 4 Kumaras, if you look at it, he actually, remembered the Lord and he made this creation. Hence, you see, it is a combination of both Sarga and Visarga, right? Now, these 4 Kumaras, they're Manasika Putras of Brahmaji. So you know this pastime that these 4 Kumaras, they went to the Vaikuntha Loka. After crossing the 6 gates, they went to the 7 gates. And they were stopped by the gatekeepers of Jaya and Vijaya, right? Now, initially, the 4 Kumaras were meditating upon the Brahman feature of the Lord. Now, this pastime goes on that, you know, they curse the Jaya and Vijaya. And then when they enter, they see they smell the fragrance of Tulsi at the lotus feet of the Lord, and that changes their consciousness towards the Bhagavan aspect and features of the Lord, right? Now, these 4 Kumaras, after realization, they do not support in the progeny, the creation aspects that Brahmaji wanted, right? So now Brahmaji is so worried and then he is thinking about what to do. Now, he is calling from his body. So Brahmaji, from his body, he creates many things, right? He creates the Veda Shastras. He creates all the elements that you see in this material world. Everything comes out of his body. And that's the empowerment that he gets from the Lord. So he creates Swayambhu Manu. And he is telling Swayambhu Manu that he needs to expand the population. Now, but at that point in time, when Swayambhu Manu came into rule, he said that this earthly planet is fallen down into the Garbha ocean. So while Brahmaji is contemplating how do we get the earth out of the Garbha ocean, Varahadev in a very small form manifests from his nostrils. He manifests in such a small form and then slowly grows in size and becomes really big, right? He becomes so big. And the appearance of Varahadev actually happens in the Swayambhu Manu Mantra, right? So this Varahadev is called Shweta Varaha. Now, Maitreya Muni is also describing a Varaha incarnation that happened in the Chakshusha Manu also, right? So now in the context we are talking about is Swayambhu Manu, but he is also talking about the Chakshusha Manu, which happens in the 6th Manvantara. So in the 6th Manvantara, when Varahadev appeared, that is when he killed Hiranyakashipu. In this appearance of Varahadev in the Swayambhu Manu time period, he does not have those pastimes with Hiranyaksha, right? So that is something that we want to note here. Okay, so in the 6th Manvantara, when he appears, he kills Hiranyaksha, right? In the 1st Manvantara, when Varahadev appears from the nostrils of Brahmaji, he just lifts the earth because Swayambhu Manu is unable to perform his activities according to the request of Brahmaji, right? And in this Varaha is called Shweta Varaha, while in the 6th Manvantara, he is called Neela Varaha, right? Sometimes they also call him as Rakta Varaha, right? So this is the difference between Varahadev appearance in one day of Brahma in multiple Manvantara times, right? In one day of Brahma is called one Kalpa, and one day of Brahma there are 14 Manvantaras, and each Manvantara is ruled by one Manu, right? Okay. So you see, so the creation mainly originates, right, in the Bhumandala period. So creation also happens to some extent in the upper planetary system, but not much. But a lot of the creation that happens only in the Bhumandala and through Swayambhu Manu, right, and his daughters and his descendants and things like that. Okay. So now comes to the question. So why are we talking about Swayambhu Manu, and then what is the connection here? So Swayambhu Manu's dynasty, if you look at the dynasty, he had 3 daughters and 2 sons, right? The 2 sons, you will see them descriptions in the 4th canto and the 5th canto. The 4th canto will talk about Uttanapada, right? And then you will see Uttanapada, and then you will see Dhruva, Prithu, then Prachina Barhish. So all those things you will see descriptions in the 4th canto. Then you will see the other son is Priyavarta, right? So that is in the 5th canto, you will see about Nabi, Rishabdev, Bharata, and all those personalities in the explanation. So that is the 2 sons of Swayambhu Manu. In the 3rd canto, he is having 3 daughters. In the current 3rd canto, we'll talk about Devahuti, Akuti, and Prasuti, right? And descriptions of Akuti and Prasuti are described more in the 4th canto, but while in the 3rd canto, only description about Devahuti and the pastimes would be described here, right? So now at this point in time, Vidura is deviating his question to ask, how come Devahuti's descriptions are given here and what is her life, right? So because of that question, we'll see Devahuti's life got, descriptions of Devahuti life got described here, and then it gets deviated into the subject matter. Now, Swayambhu Manu's daughter is Devahuti, and then when Swayambhu Manu wanted to search for an husband, he wants to find an eligible husband who can marry and take care of his daughter. So he gives Devahuti to Kardama Muni. So Kardama Muni is a very, very elevated devotee, and he's an eligible devotee, eligible to marry Devahuti. So when Swayambhu Manu approached Kardama, it is written in Bhagavatam that Kardama actually performed meditation for 10,000 years in order to marry, right? So we must have seen in various pastimes that a devotee performs 10,000 years, 1,000 years of austerity to get a child, but here, he's asking about 10,000 years to get married, right? So that is when Swayambhu Manu approaches Kardama to give his daughter to him. Now, time also is a context, right? So for example, now, in those days, in Satyuga, if you see, the time of 10,000 years is actually very, very small. It's like 1 or 2 years here and something like that. So even in Kali Yuga, you see, the maximum life is about 100 years, and then brahmachari life itself is about 25 years. And after that, some may wait for 5 years, 10 years in order to search and things like that. So it's similar to that. So 10,000 years in Satyuga is not a large time scale. Now, when Swayambhu Manu wanted to give his daughter to Devahuti, Kardama actually promises that he will take care of her and he will also give a progeny of a child, a male child, to Devahuti. So then the marriage goes, and then the life of Kardama Muni and Devahuti goes on. Devahuti, even though she is a great queen, she is a daughter of such a great personality, so she is like a queen, and she's very, very beautiful in her personality. She doesn't bother about her kingly experience, kingdom-based experience. So she is very eager to serve her husband. And she serves her husband in a hermit without any expectations, right? So that's the mood of Devahuti. Now, Kardama Muni, after getting pleased for the services of Devahuti after a very, very long time, he decides to leave in search of completion of his human journey of life. So at that time, Devahuti is asking that, you're just leaving me and going. What happens to my life? How do I take care of my life? So Kardama Muni promises and then gives her 9 daughters. Now, even though she gets 9 daughters, she says, I am not satisfied with those 9 daughters because I need a son who will take care of me. All right. Now, it is important to understand that why she is asking for a son, because there are 3 reasons. One, all this years she's been serving the husband, but she has not spent her time in self-realization. So she is sort of depending on her husband's mercy. Now, when Kardama Muni wanted to leave, he has offered Devahuti that I will give you a boon where no other husband can give. What boon? I'll give you love of Godhead straight away. So, but at the time, she was more about, hey, I want children because, if my husband leaves and goes, whom do I live with? And so that's her consciousness. So, she wanted a son. So now if you see this, this is a very, very important point that you need to look at it, right? Kardama Muni wanted to offer her love of Godhead, but she became more into thoughts of children and all those things. So she didn't pick the topmost. So now later on, after the 9 children, she is realizing that, hey, I need to understand this transcendental subject, and I need a method to reach the lotus feet of the Supreme Lord. So hence he is asking a child, right? So there are print of reactions, right? Now Kardamuni blesses her with a male child, and because Kardamuni is a great realized devotee, the Lord appears in the womb of devotee. Now, generally we may think that each one of us are going always in search of God, right? It is said that, Kardamuni is like a role model now. You've spent a life of brahmacharya ashram, then you spend a life of grihastha ashram. Now, it's time that you take vanaprastha or sannyasi and then go in search of God. So that's exactly what is he following. But the God, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, appeared in the womb of devotees. So now why do you need to go in search of God separately, right? So author writes a very brilliant example as to how realized souls behave, saying that when I descended, Kardamuni, when he descended in the mood of dasyaras, right? Dasyaras is what? Servitude, right? Like a menial servant. Now, but when he stays at home because Lord is there, his own child, and he wants to serve the Lord, then he will serve the Lords in Vatsalyaras, right? So this causes a conflict in the consciousness of Kardamuni, and hence he decides to leave to the forest. Forest meaning leave family life and then go away, right? So that's another way to understand why Kardamuni leaves, his child and mother and then leaves to the forest. Okay, so devotee makes use of this opportunity in a very, very great nature. She is asking very, very relevant questions, right? So if you look at the third canto, if you see all the chapter 25 and above is all about her interaction with Kapila and then Kapila's instruction. Through Kapila's instruction to Devahuti, we are learning many, many principles, okay? And what we will do is now we'll spend time to just understand those questions. What are the areas that the conversation that happened between Kapila Deva and Devahuti, right? So the first area of question that Devahuti is asking Kapila Muni is, she says that, this Mahamaya, these three gunas are very bewildering in nature, right? It actually causes illusion at all points in time. So how do we overcome this? And if we are always illusioned, then we are not going to do the right things. We will be completely, spend innumerable number of time, many, many millenniums in this Prakriti. So she is asking how to dispel this my illusion, right? So that's the first set of questions she asked to Kapila Muni. Now, Kapila Muni is answering. He's talking about Adhyatmika Yoga, or what he calls Sankhya Yoga, right? So, the biggest aspect of his Sankhya Yoga that is explaining is, he's talking about, what is Sankhya philosophy is talking about? He's talking about this spirit and matter, and what are the interactions between them, right? So when he is explaining that, while you understand spirit and matter and their interactions, and he's talking about superiority of bhakti over it, and he's explaining how devotee demonstrates his characteristics of practicing bhakti within these interactions of this material nature, right? So that's the kind of detail he's giving under the Sankhya Yoga section, right? Now, it is very important for devotee to understand, because if she does not understand that all this material nature and creation are a product of the nature, the energy of the Lord, then we will never see the relationship of this material nature to the Lord. Then we'll always see this material nature is independent of the Lord, and that will not help us. And that will put one into more and deeper illusions, right? So that's why she's asking such a question, and Kapila Muni is actually explaining those details. Okay. Then next she's asking, how do I get bhakti, right? How do I get bhakti to attain the lotus feet of the Lord? How do I get that attitude of generating that love of Godhead, right? So Kapila Muni is explaining that any activity that is done in this material plane will only give reactions, fruitive reactions, either positive or negative, right? But he says the only activity that is called Bhakti Yoga or devotion service unto Supreme Lord, right, can elevate one above these three modes of material nature, right? So in that he explains that spontaneous bhakti is the topmost, right, which we call it as Raganuga Bhakti, right? Then he is talking about even though spontaneous love of Godhead is the topmost, it is difficult for one to practice spontaneous love of Godhead. So he drills down to explain the importance of practicing Vaidika Bhakti, right? So generally we are not qualified because we may not get love of Godhead so instantaneously. So we practice Vaidika Bhakti. And through practice of Vaidika Bhakti for a larger period of time, one will acquire love of Godhead, and that love of Godhead will be more spontaneous in nature to perform his activities, to services, and to remember the Lord, to hear about the Lord, and all these things, right? So he is distinguishing between the sadhana bhakti and raganuga bhakti, and he's also talking about superiority of ragana bhakti over Vaidika bhakti and how that can be achieved in a stage manner, right? So that's the second kind of descriptions that Kapila Muni is giving to Devati. Now, even though now she understood, okay, I understood that there's a method to dispel Maya. Now, how do I attain bhakti? She understood. But she's asking further clarifying questions too on the aspects of jnana and yoga, so that she can understand a comparative method between how bhakti yoga is superior to other forms of yoga, right? So in reality, you see, generally people consider, oh, bhakti is so simple. How come, how can this be the topmost? So that's the kind of consciousness that one have. Now, with that kind of consciousness that, bhakti is so simple, this is not the topmost, there is a tendency for people to choose complicated methods of Ashtanga Yoga or any other yogas and try to practice that, thinking that that is the ultimate solution, right? So hence, Devhuti is asking clarifying questions to do a comparative analysis, okay, between Bhakti Yoga, between Ashtanga Yoga, various other processes of yoga, which is superior. So in order to understand that, she's asking the next set of questions, right? Now, when she's asking this question, Kapila first explains about the Sankhya process, right? What is Sankhya? Sankhya is about understanding the material elements, both spirit and matter, its interactions, Prakriti, Purusha, and all its elements. So that's what he explains in very, very detail. Now, what's the difference between the Sankhya philosophy that's been talked about and then the Sankhya philosophy or what we're talking about in science today? What is the real difference? In science also, it is also about understanding matter, understanding, for example, you have the periodic table. You take the periodic table and then say, okay, this element, that element, and then what's interaction. So it's all about the same thing. Understanding the earthly elements and then how the interaction happens. But the problem with the science today is all analysis and things like that are independent of the understanding and presence of God. That means they think science is ultimate, mathematics is ultimate, and there is no place for God in their analysis. But the Sankhya philosophy that was explained by Kapila Muni is clearly talking about how Lord creates, how Brahmaji creates as a secondary creator, and how these modes of material nature interact. So, for example, when Brahmaji creates, yes, the body has been created. All the elements on this earth have been created, but no interaction were happening. Even though the soul entered, no interaction were happening until the Lord glanced it, until the three gunas got activated, right? So, you see, even though it is the same analysis of matter and spirit, but in relation to God. in relation to the Supreme Creator. And that is the Sankhya philosophy that Kapila Muni described, right? So we have this Karya Srishti and Karana Srishti, right? So before and after. So like that, all these details that Kapila Muni is able to explain to Devahuti. He's also explaining how Jiva is in a conditioned state all the time, and how he, due to illusion, that he connects himself to the material elements and not to the spiritual elements, right? So he's talking about the knowledge, right? So through attainment of knowledge, a Jiva can understand his real position, real origin, that he doesn't belong to this material world, but he belongs to the spiritual energy of the Lord. And by practice of intense bhakti, right? He can enlighten himself. He can enlighten himself and unentangle himself from this material world, which causes liberation for him, right? So, the conclusion of preachings of Kapila is that in general, Prakriti cannot harm an soul, right? If the soul starts to practice Bhakti Yoga, that means it is into the path of enlightenment. In such a path, this Prakriti, the interactions of Prakriti cannot cause any difficulty to the living entity. So that's the kind of conclusion he gives in the process of Jnana. Then in the processes of yoga, he's talking about Ashtanga Yoga, Yama, Niyama, Dharana, Dhyana. So like that is going on. So where he is talking about Dhyana is on meditating on the forms of the Lord, right? So he's giving all the details about how one can practice this Ashtanga Yoga. And he also concludes that Ashtanga Yoga is a very, very complicated process to achieve the mercy of Godhead. But Bhakti Yoga as a conclusion is the best way to achieve love of Godhead, right? Then Devahuti is asking the next question, that explain the path of Bhakti in detail, right? So explaining path of Bhakti in detail is about understanding the various limbs of Bhakti, the various angas of Bhakti. And then it is also talking about what are the pure characteristics of Bhakti, right? And Kapila Muni is also explaining about the offenses. What is the, aspect of performing or doing an offense, and then how does it impact your Bhakti, right? So like that, Kapila Muni is explaining. So different classes of Bhakti. He's explaining pure Bhakti, Anabhilashita Shunnam Jnana Karmadi Anavritam. So he's talking about how Bhakti, bereft of any adulteration on the platform of material attributes, is called pure Bhakti, and how that will please the Supreme Lord, right? So he's also talking about those details in nature. And in the dangers of offenses, he's talking about the details of the mad elephant offense. Then he's talking about how offenses to the Supreme Lord or offenses to the Vaishnavas causes one to lose taste for Bhakti, right? So the conclusion is, if someone says, hey, I'm a great servant of the Lord, but he does not have any respect for others, or he looks down upon others, so it doesn't produce positive results, it produces offenses, right? So that's the details of Bhakti Yoga that he explains in this section. Then she's asking about what is nature of time and how Kala works. And then she's asking about characteristics of time and how time influences one's, the gross and the subtle aspects of one's body. And what does it have impact in one's life? It is also talking about activities before death and activities after death. So near-death experience. So all these details is being explained here in the characteristics of time. You will see that there are more and more expressions given that, when a living entity is in this material world, how he by performing, great devotional service, how he purifies and returns back to Godhead. And while devotees or living entities who do not perform these go into after death, where they go into Yamalok and suffer. All these details he starts to give as an attributes of time, right? So like that, she's asking questions about birth, death of the jivas, what happens, and then how he transcends, how the vasanas in one's heart acts as impressions that makes him to carry to birth after birth after birth. So, how a child which is born grows to a youth, adult, old age, and then leaves this body. So all these details are asked, and then Kapila Muni clarifies all those details. So you see the last sections, that means chapter 25 onwards, you see complete details about all these things are explained in Canto 3. Now, to talk about the entire canto in about an hour's time is so difficult that we can only spend ourselves into the highlight of the topic at a 10,000 feet level, and then explain what are the details that are existing, so that when we go read this chapter, the section wise, we can understand the context, right? So that's pretty much the summary of Canto 3. And of course, in the Varaha pastimes that explained by Maitreya Rishi to Vidra, he also explains about how Diti got influenced by wanted to unite with Kashyap Muni, and then resulting in Hiranyakashipu and Hiranyaksha. So then the birth of Prahlad Maharaj. So all those details are also explained in nature. Of course, we will see them in the future cantos also. But in the third canto, these expressions are also given as a summary. Okay. So that's pretty much about the Canto 3. We can have the floor open for questions.
Thank you, Prabhuji, for the wonderful session. Was really very inspiring and interesting session. I hope that everyone got very good understanding of the third canto as a summary. So yeah, anyone wants to have ask a question? Yeah, Kameshwari Mataji, you can ask the question.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Very nicely summarized. I have one doubt, Prabhu. You told that Kardama Muni has descended in the mood of Dasya. And if he serves the Lord, it will become in the mood of Vatsalya. So he wanted to be in the Dasya mood, so he left the home for self-realization. Prabhu, is this mentioned somewhere in Bhagavatam, or is it our Acharya's explanation, Prabhu?
It is Acharya's explanation. It is Acharya's explanation, Mataji.
Prabhu, and continuing the same question, Prabhu, when Vatsalya mode is on a higher platform than Dasya, so why he preferred to be in the Dasya mode?
What Acharya says is that he is serving the Lord in the spiritual planets in the Dasyaras, right? So that is the mood he is in, and for him to suddenly, serve the Lord in a Vatsalya mood, he finds it more in an incompatible situation, and that's the reason that he does not want to spend. Now, what happens in such a situation? So let's go back to Canto 11, right? So let's see what happens to Vasudeva, right? Now, Vasudeva actually got bewildered in dealing with his two sons, Krishna and Balaram. Now, Vasudeva, if you look at it, the biggest issue was Vasudeva was not practicing devotion, because he saw that, hey, Krishna and Balaram may be Supreme Personality of Godhead, but they are my sons. How can a father worship his own son? right? So he got bewildered, and then he was completely going off the track. And then you see Bhagavatam explains that how we should not do these things. So now, generally, when someone, is trying to connect on a different rasbhav, then you see that they may not be able to understand it. So hence, Kardama, knowing this factor very well, he probably decided to not to stay and practice that.
Thank you, Prabhu. Very wonderful.
Hare Krishna.